Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lesson. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be focusing our efforts on creating a set for animation. Now, big difference from what we did before, which was we created smaller props here and there, but when we first started, we really didn't have a game plan, and we kind of went in a way where everyone made something very similar. We started with basically making a simple chair, table, eventually evolving to couches, and eventually evolving to other stuff. And then after about halfway through the class, we started veering off into our own custom directions. Right now, what I'd like to do is I want us to have a direction that everyone's going to have specifically for their character and such. So instead of us starting with a prop and so on, we're actually going to be doing this in a more professional way. Now, the way that we're going to be what we're going to be going over tonight is talking about creating what's only needed and not going beyond a certain point, how to get started. Of course, that's always important. And blocking elements out, basically how most professional projects would get started, especially any elements that would require interactivity like games and such. Getting started with an interior for Maya, and also how to approach an exterior, even if you decide that you're going to be blocking it out. So the way I like to start this off is I want us to look at a bit of an older show, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and it's one of the things I like about this particular show is, at least for this particular part, is it very well demonstrates what we are going to try and do for our own environments. So let's actually take a look. I'm not sure if audio will come in, so this should be an interesting thing for us to see.
That's right, we are rich. I like being rich. Cool.
We so rich. Why we can't afford no ceiling?
Now, one of the reasons why I like to show that is I'm sure anyone who watched either Fresh Prince of Bel-Air or pretty much almost any movie, sitcom, I'm sorry about that, might not have ever seen the ceiling for their actual set, and there's a good reason for that. If you're not going to ever see it, why bother making it? Not to mention the fact that the way that those sets were made, being able to keep that area without the ceiling the way that they did keeps it so that they could actually get more creative with the lighting, put more lights in certain areas if necessary, and make sure that everyone is properly lit to basically make it come out on television far better. So those are the reasons why there's no ceiling. And in our case, it's going to be similar principles. We're basically going to be making a set similar to what we see over here. I believe this was from the TV show Mom. I believe it was one of the earlier seasons before they got their apartment. And again, the nice thing about this is we don't have to worry about any elements seeping through and so on. Although granted, we do have the ability to kind of bend and break physics in 3D, but in this case, let's avoid that if we can. But yeah, the way that we're going to set this up as well is we're going to use cameras to help us with this, is just like the sitcoms use for theirs. Basically making sure that those cameras only see what's absolutely necessary and not what isn't necessary. Now, one other thing to kind of consider when you're working with these sets is I strongly recommend using what's called the 180-degree rule when it comes to any camera movement, motion, camera placement, and so on. That basically means you putting a little area that your camera is not going to go past, whether you're actually moving it, rotating it, whatever. And the purpose of this is to make sure that, well, first of all, you don't break the illusion that a set like this basically ends eventually in a way that's not normal or not real, is probably better said. And this is going to be more of a thing for later. You don't want to be in a situation where if you have two characters talking like this, where things could potentially get confusing. If you follow the 180-degree rule here, it does make that considerably better. Now, looking at this more how it would be done practically, and a little bit similar to what we're going to be getting into, again, past this certain line, we'd have no clue that there's anything past this or what's past this. So there might be a whole living room over here for all we know, or better yet, for all our audience knows. But because the camera doesn't go past that, we don't have to put any kind of extra furniture and so on. So we only have to focus our efforts in this area. And again, it does make the modeling far more streamlined. I wouldn't say it would be easier, but at the very least, it's far more efficient. So that's one of those things that you want to do when you're creating yourself a set, be it for animation or otherwise. So that's pretty much the big thing that I want everyone to consider when they're doing this. Now, let's get into the next topic, which is, well, how do we get started? Well, ideally, and what I would like everyone to do is I'd actually like everyone to make a quick thumbnail of the actual set that you want to create for yourself. So, but before we get into that, I just wanted to quickly show just some sets that could potentially be used in 3D. Again, this is kind of what I'm talking about here. So I accidentally jumped the gun there. Sorry about that. But yeah, we have all our environment elements in these areas, potentially where things are going to be seen and so on. But again, past a certain point, we're not going to see anything beyond here and such. Of course, this was probably meant for different purposes, but it helps with our discussion pretty easily. Now, this is basically supposed to be a level for an actual driving game. That was actually kind of interesting to see this. But once again, the way that this particular game is going to be made, we only would see this area over here. We wouldn't see anything behind our person. So this is basically where it goes a little bit more practical for what we're going to be doing. So this is the kind of stuff that you should be considering when making these elements. So lastly here, and now then we can get into concept work. Again, basically we have our main set, we have our main elements, all the stuff is put into proper place, looking pretty good too. But what eventually is going to happen is, when we're making our scene, once we get to about this spot, we're going to stop because we don't need to make anything here. I don't need to make anything here. This is pretty much all that's required at this time. And that's kind of a good thing. Because again, if we try to make as much from behind as possible, it would definitely take a little bit more time. And if we're not going to see it, why make it? So that's pretty much the big elements when it comes to 3D and making the sets that you need. So now we'll get into the concept work. Now, ideally, when you're making your concepts, you want to have a good idea of what eventually is going to be there. And you should have as clear of an idea as possible. Trying to basically make stuff up on the go is not usually the best idea because, again, you never know if you have to add stuff in later for one reason or another. But having a game plan will give you an idea of what eventually needs to be made, and eventually you could allocate those particular environment elements to teams if you decide that you want to go that route, or even just plan it out yourself. How long is it going to be to make a dock like this? How long is it going to be to make a walkway like this? How long is it going to take to make this area over here? And you can kind of plan ahead now that you have a little bit more experience under your belt when it comes to making 3D models. Kind of going back in this area, same deal. Again, you're just trying to get a little bit of a mental inventory of what you must make for that particular scene. So for example, over here we have an area where we're going to need to make a lake. That's going to be a pain in the butt, but should hopefully look pretty good. We'll need to make a boat, oars obviously, a little log for this person to sit on, and some forest in the background and such. And again, the more that we have, the more we know what we need to make. Now, you don't necessarily need to keep to certain elements 100% verbatim. After all, you might find out later that maybe a log like this might not work for your scene. Maybe you want to make a bench, or maybe there'll be some elements that you make over here to help get interest for that particular area. You never know. But at least getting a good foundation does help out quite a bit. And again, some more concept work. And this is around the detail I'm looking for. I'm not looking for anything that's going to take too long. In fact, this is probably a little bit more detailed than I would be requesting. I would just say that for thumbnails, quick, sweet, to the point, but at the same time, make sure that you have the elements you need. And also remember, for our scene, I'm only going to be looking for one concept piece. So that's just something to consider with that. Okay, but once you actually have your concept work done, and again, it shouldn't take you more than a day to make this. Again, if you take more than a day, you might be going more detail than you should, because you should, again, be prepared that certain elements might eventually be cut, and so on. Okay, so next thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be doing a technique called blocking out. So, yep, this is where we get over here, blocking things out. And basically what that means is you're going to try and make your environment, similar to what you see over here. Elements will be made with very simple geometry, just to get a kind of feel on how the environment as a whole is going to look. Now, this is also going to be helpful when we eventually get to actually mine as well, and setting up our cameras and so on, so that we can get a general idea of how those elements should come into play. So, again, a little bit more blocking out, as you can see. Again, just the very bare minimum, just to make sure that, well, what we want to kind of bring into our scene will actually work. You could also do elements like this when you're going into game design and level creation and so on. So, but the important part is just get a general idea of how these spots are going to be. Again, don't take too long making these things, but again, it should be at least somewhere in the ballpark of, well, eventually where you want to get to. Now, I'd like to actually show a professional version. This was taken from the game Overwatch, and this was a level called King's Row. This is around April 2014, and what ended up happening is, they basically made this level. So I'm just actually going to make that bigger. And they basically made this level in as very simple as possible because they're still testing some stuff. And they're just basically just making sure that these elements work. They're probably testing particles. Oh, poor Mercy. That must really stink for her. And, but yeah, a lot of this stuff is made on the quick without even textures at this point. But eventually we will be putting those in. And it really is amazing to see all the elements that and how these look before the actual final version comes in. And the game for Overwatch has definitely changed compared to the way it used to be. Boink. But I think you get the general idea of what's going on here with the blocking elements out. Yeah, in this case, they wanted to see how a charge would look, if it had a different animation, although a kind of interesting thing. Eventually, they put rockets on Reinhardt over there, but that's neither here nor there. So let's take a look. That's actually some funny stuff. Okay, so right. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to talk or basically show how you could basically start off your set when you're going to be making this for yourself. Now, ideally, you'll have an idea of how big your character is going to be, or many of your characters, if that ends up being the case. In our case over here, lots of stuff on my desktop over there, we have my little character that we made in class. Now, just for the sake of our little demonstration here, I've kind of semi-finished her. I didn't finish her entirely, but I basically made her big enough that I could get a general idea of how big my environment elements will need to be to basically make this character work. So the way that I'm going to get started with this is, at least for an interior, I need to actually change the environment to basically make sure it's the size I need this to be. So again, I would strongly recommend you go to your preferences. Now, I was able to do this by going to the little gear that's over here. That looks like a button with a little old school AOL symbol. But this will get you to your preferences a little faster than what we've done before. And here, we're going to go to settings, still on feet, so that's awesome. And that's pretty much all I would really need at this time. So, okay. So I'm going to be making my environment, or should I say I'm going to be blocking out an environment to basically suit my character over here. Now, like before, I'm going to go to my plane and just basically do some testing for how big this would need to be. So I'm going to be basically making a room that's similar to my apartments. And the way that that's kind of set up, that would roughly be 20 feet by, let's see, I'm going to go with width of 20, height of 10. Okay, so this is actually pretty close. I think the width could actually be the height could be a little bit bigger. We'll put that to 15 maybe. Now it's too big. It's one of those things where it's just that close. Let's see, 13, unlucky number, but the best one that I have here. So this actually works out pretty nicely. Okay, So once you have this, another thing I'd recommend too, if you can, is give yourself a little bit of extra room where you think that your environment's going to end. So let's just say that the environment's going to end over here. Well, I'm going to want to basically make this area just a smidge bigger. So I'm actually going to go as far as going to 24 to make this a little bit longer over here. And these other areas are going to have some walls to them. So and that's pretty much how that'll work. Now that I have that, what I would do next is I'd make the walls and the back area over there. So for that to work properly, I could either make myself a plane, yet again, or alternatively, I can make myself a box, and I can always adjust it later. So easiest way to approach this, probably the box. So basically going over here. And yeah, let's see. So the height, I'm doing the height first actually. Looks like it's about, I'm actually checking my own apartment here. About 15 feet might be a little bit too high, but let's try 12. Hey, worst case scenario, you could always switch this up later. Okay. Yeah, that's way too big for an apartment, so and that's okay. That's why we have trial and error. And again, I'm more doing this to fit with my character than anything else. So yeah, the 8 foot seems to work much nicer. Now the width, I'm just bringing this out like so. And I'm going to keep on going. Yeah, this is going to be a little bit bigger. Let's see, 22. Nope, I think it was 24 actually. Ha, perfect. Okay. And again, this is going to go all the way to my corner. Bink. And then I can hit Shift D. And basically bring this to the other corner. Pretty cool so far. And then just the last area I'm going to be getting is the back section over here. So once again, Shift or Control D, whichever one you feel more comfortable with. And I'm going to rotate this exactly 90 degrees, in this case on the Y-axis. And bring this back like so. Yeah, now that everyone is a little bit more comfortable with how to make an environment, that's why I'm not going through all my details here. Again, you can make this however you want. But again, just remember you can go to your modeling toolkit over here. And I basically, again, used the main elements. I'm just going to go back to this one over here. This is my starting box, and I just went to my inputs to basically make that work first. Control D, or again, if you have difficulty with that, edit, duplicate, and I was just able to bring this over to the other side, and then basically make the duplicate over here and adjust that to suit my needs. But yeah, there we go. That's pretty much my apartment, so I'm pretty happy about that. Okay, so one other thing you got to watch out for, got to make sure that we don't go over a certain point because, you know, like Will Smith was saying, if we're so rich, why don't we have no ceiling? And in this case, we definitely want to keep track of that. Best way you can do work with something like this is a two-step process. First thing you can do is you can create yourself a camera. And again, for a little review, you just go to Create, you go to Cameras, and a normal camera, don't have to get fancy with this, should be sufficient. Just choose the camera option over here and just move it out. Now, as you can see, this camera is pretty tiny. So we're definitely going to need to make that a little bit bigger. Good news is, if you do scale the camera, like so, you're not going to have any weird effects when it comes to the actual motion. So that's going to be pretty nice. Now that I have my camera here, I can basically bring this back a little bit. Again, this is the main way that I'm going to be shooting my action for my scene. Now that I have the camera, that's step one. Step two, I need to actually make it so that what I see in my, well, first of all, I need to be able to see what this is seeing. And then I basically need to make sure that whatever I see is actually going to render. Now, the good news is, again, this is a little bit of a review, but once you understand how this works, it does make the process easier. So let's give this a try. So first thing I need to do is I need to make a view where I'm seeing this and basically my perspective at the same time. Easiest way to approach that, just click over here, and you basically have your 4 views. Now, if I click and drag this middle area, and you can tell if it's ready to click and drag by just moving this down, we're good. So that's step 1. Step 2, I go in my perspective mode just to make sure that this is working properly. Seems to be. I have a couple things still turned on, it looks like, so I'm going to turn off one element, that is the wireframe unshaded, and I'm also going to turn off the X-ray for now. I could always put that on a little bit later. Now, the big thing that's going to help here is I need to actually turn on my camera. Now, that's going to be simple. Go to my panels over here, perspective, choose camera 1, and bam, there's my camera. And if I move this camera around, you'll see everything the camera sees. And that's pretty helpful for us. And I'll just hit continue for now. Oops. Looks like it, oh, there we go. So once again, panels, perspective, camera. We'll bring this back. And again, if I'm in this view, that basically moves this. If I move this around, you'll see that this moves as well. Cool. Okay, so that basically is all set. Now, as I said before, we need to make sure that what we see here is what we get in the actual render. Because check this out. One thing I'm going to need to do first is I'm going to need to just temporarily change this from the auto renderer to the Maya render, just so I can render this quick. I'm going to give this a quick little render in this view. And basically, again, what I see here is not exactly what I'm getting. So if I hit the render in this case, so it's a little bit off. So what I could do to basically make this a little bit more accurate is I could go to View. I can go down my list until I get to, just making sure I have the right area here. Here we go. Camera and settings. So just leaving it here, camera and settings. And then go to the option where it says resolution gate. And once I click that, what I see here should be what I get. So I'm going to give this area a render, see if this works out properly. Looks like it's not rendering in the area it's supposed to. That's a little unfortunate, but I should be able to fix that by going to the render settings. And just take a look at where this is. Here we go. Renderable cameras. And just change this to camera 1. And hopefully this should actually fix up my little problem that I had. Yep, there we go. Working like a charm. So I went through that little quick, so I'm going to do that one more time. So if for some reason you're basically rendering, trying to render, and you see one view over another, easiest way to fix that is go to your settings area over here and just take a look at renderable camera. Most of the time, it should be on basically whatever you currently have selected, but in this case, since we made a new camera, that's probably why we had to switch it over here. So, just go down your list, pass file management, frame range, renderable camera is where we want to be. Just choose the camera that you've created. And that should actually be it, at least in there. Now, one other part that we don't have to worry about too much now, but will be a huge factor later, is image size. Currently, it's at HD 540. Now, the resolution we're eventually going to get to is going to be the HD 720. It's the lowest practical high definition size that we have. But the reason why we're keeping it relatively low, relative being, of course, operable word there, is we just want to make sure this renders quickly. Eventually, we're going to be adding all kinds of other elements, but this should work out pretty nicely. But that's pretty much the big thing, just making sure you have your camera, make sure your settings are correct, make sure that you go once again to View, Camera Settings, Resolution Gate, so what you see is truly what you render. And so a good chunk of my environment is now created. So now what I could do is eventually I can make some blocks like so as placeholders for elements that I'm eventually going to make. So for example, there's an area around here that's kind of my kitchen. So I'm going to make a temporary, not a permanent, but temporary area where my counter is going to be. And again, I'm not taking too much time with this. I'm just making this relatively big like this, and that's kind of blocking it out. And again, I also want to make sure that the size is appropriate to my person. So that actually looks pretty good. Oop, make sure you always select the right thing. Remember, undo's your friend. And if it's a counter, you use the Insert Edge Loop tool. Again, you don't always need to use simple geometry for everything. I'm just extruding this out. But at least it can be a placeholder for what we're doing. So this will be my counter slash, I suppose, bar. Though I can adjust and change this with relative ease. But I think this is a good spot for me. And it looks like it works out pretty well with my view. Although I think it could be better. So just going to move that. And there we go. That's nice. Okay, cool. So for the other areas around here, I could block out areas for potential furniture. Again, at least when we're in the block out stage, you don't have to worry about getting too crazy with this yet. Yep. And we'll just pretend that this is going to just go up like this. Now, of course, later on I could go a little bit further with this, but at least just making sure that everything's fitting properly. And you could even recycle props if necessary. So I could basically recycle this. There we are. And there's my couch. So my little reference here is basically my apartment, even if it's just a temporary thing. Let's bring this over here. Cool. And then, of course, I have other props I can bring into the mix as well. Eventually, something you're going to want to do is, obviously, you're going to want to make a layer specifically for your props and a layer specifically for your environment. Once again, so that you can lock these up and not accidentally move those by mistake. So many people have lost so much work when they don't do that properly. I'm going to make one more temporary blocked element here. But again, one of the reasons why it's going relatively fast for me is because I planned this all out already. So I know exactly what this is going to be looking like and what I'm kind of referencing this off of. Yeah, there we go. So what I'm making here is just my little entertainment center. And, oh, what the heck. Yeah, I got time to make it my TV. Wouldn't be a real good entertainment center if I didn't have one. But again, at least I have an idea of what's going to be where. And that's going to go down. And again, all this is most likely going to change, but we were able to already kind of plan out my area. We're seeing that everything is fitting for our character. All the props are fitting into place well. And overall, I'm actually having some fun with this. So this is actually pretty cool. I'm just going to put these in the second layer because I basically want that. All right, so we're doing great so far. We were able to kind of make a very quick blocked out area, although I will be expecting a little bit more from what everyone's going to be making. But again, think about an environment that really suits your character well. So I just figured that this girl would be doing well in an apartment or something like that. But maybe you don't want to do an apartment. Maybe you want to do an exterior instead. Well, that's the other thing I wanted to talk about today. How can you approach making an exterior? Well, once again, I'd want to show some examples before we get into this. So what we're seeing here is a little area that looks like it's eventually going to be a huge plant like this, but something to kind of, industrial plant. Now, something to consider with this scene is if we were going to be basically seeing the whole shebang, then yeah, we definitely would want to model as much as we have here. But anything that's not going to be seen, once again, we're not going to worry about it. We're just going to either make some elements that can hide those elements like what we see over here. We could add like a wall or something else, or we could just even add in the building itself because, anything past this building, do we care about it? And the honest answer is not really. I mean, if we change scenes, again, we could basically make a new scene altogether, save us some polygons. It all depends on what the objective is for the scene itself. So again, something else to consider. Now, this is actually a really pretty little scene that we have here. Very well textured, very good looking. And again, we could just be in a situation where this area over here is going to be the main section we see. Nothing beyond this point is going to be elements that we will see at all. So that actually helps us with our process quite a bit. Very cool. Similar thing with this that we have over here, that we just have all these little elements kind of blocking the way past a certain point, so that in this case, we actually don't need to make those parts, making, again, our modeling process a lot easier. So I think that was most of the stuff I wanted to show, at least for different examples of what we can do. Now let's get into actually doing this in Maya itself. And actually, before I go any further, we'll do the right thing by saving, because you should always save every so often. I'm going to resave this as EnviroTest. Now eventually I'll be giving everyone exact naming conventions and so on to basically do what's necessary. Okay, so first thing I'm going to be doing if I'm going to be making an environment is I'm going to be basically making myself a big plane. And when I say big plane, I'm not talking just like a couple tens of feet. I'm talking hundreds, possibly thousands of feet. So let's just see 100 by 100 for now. Now again, something to consider is how much are we going to see yet again? This is again why blocking stuff out can be really helpful, because once again, if we make the scene too big, it could be a real chore to try and get around the scene itself. So I'm actually pretty happy with this. So 100 to 100 it is. And I don't even really need the 100 by 100. Once we get to a certain point, we're not going to really see too much else. Okay, so I'm going to basically make this into a new referenced area. Okay, so, well, this is great and all, but we have a couple problems. For making an exterior, we need to make sure that either there's a huge horizon way, and I'm talking way in the distance, or alternatively, we can add elements to kind of block the way so that, we basically don't see anything past a certain point. Now, one way you could approach that, if you're doing kind of like a cityscape, is you can have buildings and walls kind of block the way. So for example, over here, it could be as if a wall's basically blocking this part over like so, and our audience will be none the wiser if we basically have this. It doesn't even need to be so high either. I could just basically put this relatively low like this, and we're good. Again, our audience is not going to know in these situations, so that's probably the simplest way you can approach it. Or alternatively, the second simplest, not necessarily the easiest way, is we can add some buildings in front of there. Advantage of buildings are, well, we can have a little bit of an interesting look for each of these particular buildings. So let's just say that I have a whole city block. Of course, it always helps to go into object mode. By the way, the way I'm getting this, right-click and holding, I get to all my options that I need. So again, vertex, edge, face, object mode. it's a really fast way to work if you can use your right click. So again, I'm just hitting Shift D. And again, you can have all the buildings the same if you want to. There's some situations where that actually can work. Like, for example, certain apartment buildings have similar architecture, so that's not that big of a problem. But there might be some situations where you might want a little bit of a difference. And again, an advantage of doing this is, well, basically making it look like there's some variation here and there. I'll leave that up to you. Personally, I think that a little variation is not that bad if you plan ahead for it. So I'm just going to get rid of this one entirely, and this will be like a supermarket. Whoop. Yeah, there we go. Just making sure it's not too big. And again, this is why having a little standard, which is what I have over here, can be so helpful. Because again, if it's basically the size it needs to be, that's fantastic. And if we need to make it bigger, we have that option. Not too shabby. And then, of course, we could do the same thing in this area over here. I'm actually going to just choose one. Copy, like so. Oops. Yeah. In times like this, Command D might be a better choice to go with. Or Control D, I'm sorry about that. So I'll put this way in the back. There we are. But again, the way that our camera's set up, you would never know. And if you do see an area that's a little bit empty, spacious, and such like that, that's not a big deal. You can add, in some cases, it's just as simple as adding an object in a certain spot. And bringing it out like this. Once again, no one's the wiser. Just make sure that you duplicate first before going any further. Yeah, there we go. And again, it can make the character look like she belongs in the spot that she's in. But yeah, this is basically how my blocked out scene looks like so far. And this is, again, one relatively simple but effective way if you were trying to make something like an urban environment, or if you were going to be making someplace that potentially would have a lot of buildings, but technically not be so urbanish. I wonder if that's a word, urbanish. Let's just assume that it is. Just make a quick look over here. All right, so so this is one method that, again, works pretty well. The second method that I want to use, just basically, okay, cool, is what would happen if we're trying to make something that's like a wider open space, similar to what we saw with some of those nature parts. Well, if you want to do that too, that is fine. You're probably just going to have to get a little bit higher in poly count than what we currently have. So basically over here, I could basically set this up accordingly. Yeah, put a subdivision of 100 by 100 to get started. And then you could use an old friend, the sculpt tool, to basically kind of bring a couple areas out depending on what's necessary. So once again, if you shift right click, sculpt tool. Yeah, this is way too big, so just gonna double click here. You can also get to the sculpt settings. I figured that this is something worth mentioning by going to the Sculpt tab up here, and you have a good chunk of your tools. But we're not going to need to get too crazy with this. Let's see. Oh, I got the strength. That's why it's not working. There we are. So what I'm doing here, and this is where it gets tricky because you got to keep track of, there we are. Of where your character is as well. I'm just basically making a couple of molehills, so to speak. So again, if our character looks into the distance, they see nothing beyond that part. The hard part, of course, is the fact that I'm going to have to play around with the strength in all these parts. So, and of course, if I want this to look like an actual nature scene, I also have to paint around as well. So, for example, if our character was looking this way, up to the 180-degree rule, we're good. We look this way, we're mostly good. We probably could do better. Now the only thing that kind of stinks about what I'm doing here, because I am actually making the ground a little bit rougher and such, is when you're taking steps and such, you don't want to go too crazy. I'm actually adding a little bit of a smooth over here to help out. But you want to make sure that it's not 100% even. Usually if you go outdoors, it's rare when a ground is perfectly straight. There are some exceptions, like for example, like sports stadiums, like football, baseball, those are outdoors yet again. Oh, soccer, can't forget soccer. A lot of the world plays that. And, those are situations where they are a little bit more even when it comes to, well, basically how flat those parts are. But, if you're doing something that's more natural, you probably want to make sure that you play around with the sculpt to basically make that work better for yourself. Oh, and of course, for those who might need a little bit of a refresher, if you were to, I'm going to turn up the strength quite a bit, turn down the size, I'll put this to 5 be enough. It looks like it is. And if you need to make a riverbed, if you hold down Control, this will basically make an indentation. Now this is also useful for making lakes and anything the like. The only thing that's going to be a pain in the butt is trying to texture this later, but it's still very possible. Again, if I look in my scene over here, hey, take a look at that. I got myself a little bit of a waterbed. And that's how you can approach that stuff. So yeah, it all depends on how far in the horizon you need to see. I'm going to just bring this up a little bit more, because there's a reason for this. Okay. Now, the last thing you need to do is you need to make yourself a bit of a sky. Again, just because we don't want our character to just look into darkness. Now, it's been a while since we saved, so I'm going to save this. But there's a couple ways you could approach this. One of the simpler ways that I found is you could basically make yourself a sphere and make it a very big sphere. So I'm talking like huge. So I'm going to put this to, let's say, 100 maybe. That might be too huge. Maybe 50? Okay. No, actually 80 was pretty good. Okay. So that's how you can get started. Now, if you're doing a whole 360 area, you probably would actually need to keep the whole shebang. But once again, if you're not keeping the whole 3D area, if you're not looking at a 3D angle, you don't need to keep everything, which will make setting elements up a little bit easier. So let me show you what I mean. So first of all, there's an area at the bottom where we don't see a thing. So we could actually get rid of some of this. Easiest way to approach this, obviously, would be finding the halfway point, which I have done. Select the polygon, shift double click next to it. It should select in a ring. So I'll do that one more time. Select your face or polygon, shift double click the one next to it, then hit delete. And then you can just get rid of the bottom because you really don't need that. You might want to move this down just a hair. Perfect. Okay. Now the last thing that you could do, if you just want to basically make this a little extra, not so much perfect, but just kind of want to watch out for a couple things. You can potentially even get rid of the back area, because that's not really as necessary. Cool. And I just got rid of this. So now our character can still look around to a point and still see everything. Nice thing about this too is it's relatively simple to unfold or basically unwrap as well. Now there's one part that's missing that we haven't done yet that I'd like to do now, but this is pretty much how you can make yourself a very simple sky. Once you're at this point, you could go to Mesh Display, Reverse, something we've done a couple times before, and the polygons will be facing the correct direction, making any kind of sky relatively easy. And that's pretty much most of the elements you can do to basically make this work. Of course, once that's done, you could use whatever kind of shapes you want to block out your scene. So for example, over here, maybe I got some trees. Although be careful with making trees. Those things are a pain in the butt sometimes, particularly if you want to put leaves on them. That being said, if any of you are interested in checking that out, I could either show some tutorials or just make them myself so you can see how they are approached. But I got my tree here. Maybe the trees are on the other side. Oop. This is when the Shift D is kind of helpful for us. Now, one thing you could also do is once you've made one very distinct, cannot stress that enough, distinct shape, it can be basically made as a standard for many others. But I'll leave that up to you if you want to, how you want to approach this. But yeah, just try and block out the scene first before anything else. That's pretty much the scene so far for this gal. Again, if she ends up being more attached to nature, or again, we could put her back in the city. That's completely our call on this one. So just going to save this one because it could be kind of useful later. Seriously, you never know. But yeah, got my layer over here. Gonna add that in. Gonna hide that, and cool. So again, this is basically what it looks like when it's an outdoor scene. This is more of an urban area, and this is my apartment area. Oh, got to remember to bring back my. Yep, there we are. Only thing is I got to make sure that I don't go past a certain point or things are going to get tricky. So that's pretty much most of the stuff I wanted to show in terms of the environments and everything else. Most of the time if we were doing this in class, I'd give everyone a chance to kind of try this out and experiment and then ask some questions. Since we're in the situation we're in, everyone will have a chance to kind of practice this on their own time. So hopefully we're able to take notes, even mentally or physical ones. And this will actually get us to our next part, the last part that we were going to be talking about. And that is what the homework's going to be. Now, I'm going to put this on Blackboard as well so that you'll have it. But I wanted to talk about this very quickly. So, the assignment 7, which is misspelled. Shame on me. Right-click. Yes, I meant assignment. Thank you, Google Docs. Animation set. So, pretty much what we just did for our lecture right now. It's basically making yourself an animation set that could be blocked out and eventually refined so that by the end of the semester you have something you can animate your character in. So one of the other reasons why I like blocking things out first before you actually do the actual animation, we want to make sure that our environment is efficient when it comes to the modeling. In other words, we don't go into millions of polygons worth of information. Because even though we do have stronger computers compared to what we used to have, they still can be slowed down. I'm sure everyone remembers basically what happens if you try and smooth something past an iteration of 5. That did not end well, but that's okay. So let's take a look in terms of the official objective. Create a blocked out scene, blocked out environment for your character with the eventual goal for a short animation. You will need to create a rough drawing, so you're going to need to draw this out a little bit first. A blocked out scene, which is similar to what I've shown you, the 3 different options, and one finished asset. Now, I'm only looking for modeling at this time, but eventually these are going to be elements you'll need to texture. And I am going to be looking for everyone to go beyond simple geometry for your actual asset you're going to be using. So you're going to need to put a little elbow grease in this, ladies and gents. So let's see. By the end of the assignment, you should be on your way to making an animation that will work well with your character. Or let's actually change that up. A scene for a set. Very cool. Now, once again, the specifications are the following. Draw a rough of the scene you want to make for yourself. Please consider what kind of elements will be part of your scene. So again, if you want to make an interior, totally fine. You want to make an exterior, also totally fine. But consider what assets or props and whatnot are going to be part of that scene. So that's the first part. Second, you're going to actually go into Maya. Ideally, you'll want to actually bring in your character as well as your standard, even if it's just half your character, just to make sure the environment is working well for them. As you saw in my previous example, having that character made such a difference when it came to my scene. So, model one asset. And if you haven't finished it yet, please continue working on your character's clothes and shapes. So, for example, again, you want to make sure that your character looks like they're coming along, and also make sure that the any kind of anatomy also starts looking a little bit more human. I think most of you were able to get to that point, but it's worth repeating, which is the reason why I'm doing that right now. This is going to be worth 100 points, and we'll talk about the name in class itself. So don't worry about the name at this point. We'll discuss that at a later time, or I'll put that up and make sure I make a general announcement. So that's pretty much it for tonight. I just want to say that this was a pleasure doing this. And what I'll do is I'll give everyone the due date for the next tutorial, which is going to be coming up, not next week because you all have spring break, but the week after most likely. So if you run into any issues or problems, I'll keep an eye on my email so that you can do that. But that's pretty much it. Unless anyone has any questions, I hope everyone enjoys their break, and I'll see you on the next one.